Hello, everyone, and welcome to APS Webinars. The title of today's webinar is Change Agents, Mentoring for Change in Physics. I'm Farah Dawood, and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Thank you all for joining us. APS Webinars are brought to you as a service of the American Physical Society, connecting you with the expertise of individuals who can offer insight into physics careers, educational programs, and professional development for students, working physicists, and educators. Today's presentation features Dr. Roxanne Hughes. Dr. Hughes will talk about how physics is perceived and how this perception affects entry and persistence in the field. After Dr. Hughes finishes the presentation, the remainder of the program will belong to you for our question and answer session. Because of the number of people attending this webinar, we are only able to accept text questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the questions panel located on the right side of your screen. You may submit questions through the questions panel at any time during the webinar, and we will answer all of your questions at the end. We will do our best to cover all of your questions, but we want to apologize if we are unable to cover everything. Finally, a link to the recording of today's presentation will be emailed to you after today's event and will be made available on the webinar homepage. Please allow 5 business days for video upload. And so with that, let's get started. Dr. Roxanne Hughes is the director of the Center for Integrating Research and Learning at the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory, or MagLab. She has also directed the MagLab's diversity and inclusion programs from 2014 to 2019. Her research interests include programs and policies that attempt to increase the number of women and marginalized populations in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields by changing the climate within these fields. She has been a part of the panel discussions of the American Association of University Women Solving the Equation report, and recently the SciGirls National Program for Engaging Girls in STEM. She has also served on the American Physical Society's Committee on the Status of Women in Physics, the FSU Diversity and Inclusion Council, the FSU National Coalition Building Institute, and the MacArthur Foundation's 100 and Change Review Panel. Well, with that, I won't take much more of your time. Roxanne, please take it away.
Thank you, Farah. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to speak to all of our attendees. So with that, I will start up. Again, this is Change Agents Mentoring for Change in Physics. I always like to introduce myself to physicists to say that I am not a physicist by training. So whatever biases come to mind when I say that, I am actually a education researcher. So as Farah has said, I focus on how we can improve programs and policies and opportunities for learning so that we can increase the representation of girls, women, and people of color in these fields. And that has focused on physics because of my work at the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory. So I know folks like to know what the workshop will cover. So this first slide is just outlining that. First, learning about the culture of physics. And you might say, but I'm a physicist, I know the culture. Sometimes if we are the dominant member of a particular community, we don't see the culture around us or how it is perceived. So that's why I highlight that at the beginning. And then learn about how this culture affects who enters physics and who thrives. And then finally, we will learn how physics identity and intersectionality can help us as a discipline to increase diversity and inclusion. So with that, I wanna ask first, sorry, I got out of this. What do you picture, or what do you think most people picture when you ask them to picture a physicist? So the first thing that comes to mind usually are media representations of physicists, maybe some really prominent and famous physicists, as these black and white pictures indicate. But these are some of the ways in which we in our society view physicists. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but if media is promoting this portrayal of physicists, you can understand why some people might have a sense of physicists as a lone male working in their lab according to these concrete steps, and then they always have a successful conclusion that results in a Nobel Prize or some kind of change, as opposed to the reality of physics, which is very different from that. And I know those of you who are in attendance are physicists, and you know the reality of physics. But if this is how folks perceive physics, think about undergraduates that are coming into physics departments and how they're coming in. How much exposure have they had to physicists? So the current status of physics, I like to start with this. I know most of those of you who are familiar with this, you probably are already aware of these percentages and numbers. But first, I'm going to go through race and ethnicity in terms of current status of physics. African Americans represent 3% of physics bachelor's degrees and 1% of PhDs, although they represent 13% of the US population, according to the US Census data. Hispanic Americans, or Latino, Latina, and Latinx represent 7% of physics bachelor's degree and 2% of PhDs, compared to representing 18% of the US population. And Indigenous peoples represent 0.2% of physics bachelor's degrees and PhDs, compared to representing 1.3% of the US population. When we move to women, we see that women represent 20% of physics bachelor's degrees and doctoral degrees, compared to representing 50% of the US population. And there has been some improvement over the last decade in the representation of women and Hispanic students in physics. However, Indigenous people, American Indians, and African Americans representation has either stayed the same, or in the case of African Americans, has actually declined. So this tells us that there's something going on that is making this happen. And most people, I think these webinars have shown you that there's a variety of causes for this. But one of the prominent features that anthropologists, that sociologists study is this idea of culture and the role that culture plays on who perceives that they can succeed and who perceives that this is not a community for them to succeed in. So just to give us a common definition of culture, I'm going to use this definition: a shared set of implicit and explicit values, ideas, concepts, and rules of behavior that allow a social group to function and perpetuate itself. So you can think of this in terms of, if you look at the apprenticeship model, another form of that anthropologists use is communities of practice. So if you look at this concept of novices come into the community, they're mentored along, they form a competence level, they take classes, they start to determine what specific area within the community they want to focus on in physics, and then they are mentored and they gain more experience, and then they become an expert in their field in the case of academia or what have you. So again, you need to have some of these shared values, ideas, and concepts. But what if those shared values are actually not shared, or are actually pushing certain people out of the field? So few studies have focused on the culture of physics. Most have done an amorphous culture of STEM. But what these studies that have focused on the culture of physics have found is that physics is an extreme culture of objectivity. When I first mentioned thinking about the culture of physics, your first reaction might have been, there is no culture in physics. Like, what are you talking about? And that's part of this idea of it's completely objective. There is no subjectivity. There's no culture. It's just physics. And then part of the idea of the culture of physics is that success is based on, in some cases, innate competence. The way that stories are told of Nobel laureates often don't incorporate all of the failures that came before. And then this idea of arrogance, also associated with success in physics. And I put this one here, Leslie et al., the 2015, because if I called someone arrogant, it might be misconstrued as an insult. And Leslie et al.'s study, they actually looked at multiple disciplines across academia, including some social science like economics, some humanities like philosophy, and then the STEM fields like physics. And when they surveyed faculty to ask them, who is successful in your field and what categories are required for that success, the common response by physicists was that there has to be some natural capabilities and this sense of you have to be able to withstand any kind of criticism. But what this study also found is that those same disciplines, and it wasn't just physicists that said this, it was also economics faculty and philosophy faculty. But those disciplines that really ascribe to this innate competence and arrogance had the least diversity in terms of students and faculty. So there's some connection here with this cultural perspective, with these concepts of who succeeds. So that being said, I'm going to pose some poll questions here, or Farah's going to pose a couple of poll questions just for us to get at what is the culture of physics. And Farah, just let me know. I'm not seeing the polls, but it could just be my screen. So Farah, I'm sharing poll results. How do I see those? Let's see. So I am not seeing the poll results on my screen.
Well, sure, I can read the results out to you of each poll.
Perfect, that would be great, thank you.
Okay, so the first question was, have you ever been mistaken for the administrative support person or janitor in your department? And 29% of our audience says yes, 71% says no. And here is the second question. So the second question was, do you know of a woman or person of color who has been mistaken for the administrative support person or janitor in your department or office? And the poll results, 37% of our audience says yes, and 63% say no. And the third question is up right now. And this question is, have you heard a sexist or racist joke in the last 2 years in your department or office? 76% of our participants say yes, and 24% say no. And here's the next question. And this question is, have you heard physicists make the claim that the discipline is colorblind? 67% of our participants say yes, 33% say no. And I believe this is the last question of this series, and this one is, have you heard physicists make the claim that sexuality and or gender do not play a role in physics? Okay, and for this, we have 76% of our audience says yes, and 24% say no.
All right,
Okay.
thank you so much, Farah. Sorry, my technical difficulties here with seeing that, but I appreciate your reading of the questions. So hearing that, knowing that folks within physics departments or in lab space or in officers, so people of color and women are being mistaken for the cleaning staff or secretaries. If you weren't one of those, imagine if that was something that happened to you on a regular basis. Maybe not daily, but if you're working late in the lab and someone questions if you belong there by asking who you are, if you're supposed to be cleaning, why haven't you cleaned their trash can out or something. Think about like that. Think of how that starts to needle in at your confidence in whether you belong or not. And then think about this idea of, well, even if that's low, how many of you have heard a sexist or racist joke in the last 2 years in your department or office? 76%. This idea of telling these jokes, I've heard folks say, well, people just need to get a thicker skin. It's just a joke. My intent wasn't to cause any harm. If you're not the recipient of those jokes, if the jokes aren't being made about the groups that you belong to, it's really hard for you to empathize with how that makes people outside of your group feel. And I'm not advocating asking, friends that come from these various other minority groups how it makes them feel, because that requires a lot more emotional labor on their part as well. But this idea, the last two questions get at something that this whole idea of physics being an extreme culture of objectivity. When you say that physics is colorblind, you're making it seem like there's actually no value to the diversity that various races, ethnicities, all of these various pieces have to making physics an even better discipline than it already has. So by saying like, I don't care about color, actually says that you don't care about a part of a person's identity that might be integral to who they are. And the same is true for sexuality or gender. I just see the work that they do, and that might be the case. But most studies on implicit bias show that we do carry implicit bias. So it's actually not this sense of colorblindness. So this is what leads to a toxic culture, a sense of people feeling like they do not belong and that they cannot thrive or be successful in a field. And it's not just me, Roxanne Hughes, saying this. There's been recent large-scale studies of sexual harassment and discrimination within physics that identify a hostile climate for women and people of color. And I've given references here, and then I have a full slide with all of these references, so you can look these up. Many of them are actually part of AIP and APS, or have authors who have worked with APS on these. And the fact is, women and people of color are treated differently in physics. The examples that I give here outline how women and people of color have to ignore parts of themselves and parts of their identity when they are in a physics space. So they might not talk about the programs that they are interested in. Or, for example, a white faculty member might, if a Black graduate student tells them, I want to get involved more with Black Lives Matter work on campus, a white faculty member might say, well, that's really going to detract from your research and studies. That may or may not be true, but if an individual is looking to interact with folks that can have a shared common experience, by isolating them more, you're actually hurting their ability to understand or to just feel their whole selves. And the same with women. Women might dress more masculine or less feminine in order to not be perceived as a stereotypical woman who's looking at, who's worried about her looks or things like that. And there's also this concept of minorities in physics, whether they be women or people of color, have to deal with the contradictory categories of being a competent physics and being a woman and or person of color. And these are contradictory. with the stereotypes that exist in our society make it seem as though women and people of color do not belong. And you saw from the examples that I gave in that first slide of what do you think of, or what do most people think of when they think of physicists, it's not necessarily people of color. And I've made an attempt to make sure to show people of color and women throughout the slides after that. But think about what that does to our internal subconscious, implicit, or even explicit senses. So with that, I want to talk about where this comes from, because I know oftentimes when I talk about this work, people say, well, it's way before they get to us. It's way before they get to us. So just to give a K through 12 trajectory of this, the culture of physics infiltrates groups differently at different times in their educational trajectory. I personally focus on K through 12 and how we can improve folks, youth, and young people's sense of belonging in STEM fields, and in particular physics. But it's not a common experience. Even this second bullet, it's a very individual experience based on cultural resources, based on class, based on schools and access. But if you look at broader studies, quantitative studies, white and Latina girls show a decline in their interest in physics beginning in high school, whereas African American girls do not. That usually happens when they encounter it in college. They have a great confidence in their abilities in physics. Boys do not show extreme differences by race and interest during high school at all, and that happens later in college. So there's various differences in terms of the experience of ethnicity and race, and even then, there are differences according to individuals. So if you ask an N of one, so one person that might represent a minority status, you might get a different response to this question. But research highlights that college is the first time where women and people of color are confronted with the culture of physics. So in high school, although APS has Step Up for Women for physics, and it's training teachers, high school teachers, to show that women can be successful in physics, a lot of high school physicists haven't even experienced the culture of physics themselves. Maybe they have a physics bachelor's degree, but most of the time they do not. So they might not even know how to translate that culture of physics. So even if they are incredibly supportive of their high school students to go for a bachelor's degree in physics, they might not know the difficulties that they might encounter. But once those students get to college, they're in a physics department, and that's their first encounter with what the culture of physics looks like. And what can happen is that they might see that I don't belong based on an encounter with one faculty member who is detrimental, either saying they don't belong, or they're not going to hack it, or they just are not a physicist, or maybe they are just ignored. No one reaches out to them. No one asks them how they're doing. So they just kind of become invisible and decide that there's better places for them. And this is why the title of this is mentoring, and how this can be a change agent. Mentoring can play a crucial role in improving this culture. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But really, for physics, most students in the K through 12 experience don't really encounter a physics class until their junior or senior year of high school. And some of them don't even take that. So physics doesn't really get into their psyche except through the media, except through that encounter with a teacher, except through maybe a physics outreach by the local college or something like that. So there are missed opportunities there as well. So this brings us to my specific research, which is focused on physics identity. And that's where my research is really found. My research is built on this foundational concept of one sense of belonging and potential success is the definition that I use for physics. And this begins with exposure to physics and interest in these concepts, so you can build on that for students in the K through 12 arena. And the main components of this foundational theory are, in order for individuals to develop a stronger physics identity, which would then lead to choosing a physics major, maybe going on to graduate school or using physics in their career, they need to develop physics skills. This is a sense of competence. And as they develop these skills, they realize they have more confidence to try harder and more challenging aspects of physics. They need to have opportunities to perform these skills. So those are things like research experiences, presentations about research, exams, and getting those supportive feedback, grades, etc., that they would receive from those. And they have to be recognized by perceived experts, so teachers, faculty, etc. And this is a cycle, so it keeps building as they get recognized, as they have opportunities to perform the skills, they feel more confident, they're willing to try more things, and they thicken their physics identity. So the sense here is to go back to that concept of physics, both physics identity and to mentoring. I'm going to go to some more poll questions here. So Farah, if you don't mind, this is how many of you are mentoring a student or early career colleague currently is the first one, I believe.
Yes, the first poll is now has been launched. And the results say that 67% are answering yes to, are you currently mentoring a student or early career colleague, and 33% say no.
Okay, great. And then the second one that Farah, I'm sure, is putting up is how many of you have ever felt like an imposter during your physics career? And by imposter, I mean like you walked in and you're like, I'm not sure I belong here. Are they really asking me this question? Do I know the answer to this? And if you have an opportunity after you've completed the poll, maybe put in the questions panel examples of when that's happened. And if you don't feel comfortable, of course, do not share it, but you could provide some of those examples. Farah, do we have results for this poll?
Yes, 74% of our audience says yes.
Great. I mean, not great, but having this sense of imposter syndrome is common, and it's not just common for those who are a minority in physics. Becoming an expert is something that for most of us is a little scary. So sometimes there might be moments where you might not think that you're the right person to go to for those questions. But this sense of imposter syndrome is even harder for those who are isolated in physics by being maybe the only person that looks like them in the department. So these are important things to be just thinking about, especially in terms of mentoring. And what this leads us to is the concept of intersectionality. So you may have heard of this concept, but the version that I'm going to use is a definition by Collins and Bilge. And they talk about the 4 domains of power in terms of intersectionality. Oftentimes, intersectionality is thrown out as a concept. In other words, like if I am a woman of color in physics, I have multiple intersections across these parts of my identity that are considered maybe negative within the field of physics. So I have to deal, and it's not a common experience. I don't have an experience just as being a woman in physics, because as a woman of color, that experience is different than a white woman in physics. And then as a woman of color, I have the intersection of being, for example, maybe Black in this, and how that is experienced. So it's not, you can't generalize across all people, and you can't generalize across all Black women. There's different experiences based on the various domains of power that occur in that. So just briefly, this is a little table to kind of show you what those are with example. But the domains of power are the interpersonal, how people relate to one another in social interactions, and how power is expressed between individuals. Thinking in terms of a faculty member with a graduate student and what that domain of power, how that hierarchy affects how folks express themselves. And the sense of the example we gave before, Black graduate students working late in the lab, and they're asked for ID in the department, but not a white student if it's late at night. So those interactions can start to build. And then you have the cultural domain of power, who succeeds and who belongs, and how the group's values are conveyed. So these are stories about historical physicists that are predominantly white, male, middle class geniuses. And you might say, I use a lot of examples of various and diverse physicists, and that's awesome. That's really great. But think about your experience maybe in undergrad or at other institutions, and think about, like, what were the stories that were shared? Was it just the Feynman stories? Was it just the Einstein stories? What is the diversity there, and how are we transmitting that knowledge from one generation to the next? The third domain of power is the structural domain. So how power is allocated within large social structures. And this also includes, for those of us who are in academia, this includes the institution that we are in. That is a structure which has historic racism and sexism inherent in it. And that doesn't take any onus off of us, but just to recognize that there's multiple aspects of how things occur within these departments. So Black students being told not to join affinity groups because it will detract from their research, this sense of what is valued, and not understanding how allowing someone to be their full person, their full, having all of their identities actually will help them to be a better physicist. And finally, disciplinary. These are the behaviors that are rewarded or punished, and by whom. So this sense of competition is praised over collaboration. Cutthroat behaviors are rewarded over collaboration and inclusion. So thinking about how those are done, and you might say individually, well, of course I reward collaboration, but step back and think about how your department or how your lab or how your office or institution rewards or punishes certain behaviors, and how that can make certain people feel less of a sense of belonging there. So that gets at these intersectionalities. And I like to use this example. We at the MagLab do a training for anyone who's going to be on a hiring committee for faculty. And this comes from the NSF Advanced Grants. This is from one of their slides and presentations, specifically University of Michigan STRIDE program. If you are not familiar with it, definitely take a look. All of their resources are free. So think about how culture is communicated. Earlier on, I think around 70% of you said that you had heard a sexist or racist joke in the last 2 years in your workspace. So that communicates a culture. Microaggressions, that sense of you're so articulate. The posters that are present. This is so the historical figures. So presidents, I believe this is from University of Michigan, but I can't remember. And these are all of their past presidents. Yes, historically, all of their presidents were white men. So think about what that conveys. So maybe you put up posters of current staff and students and faculty. Guest speakers that are invited, looking at who you bring to campus and who students get to see. So maybe you don't have any faculty of color in your department, but are you bringing those faculty in for guest speaking engagements? Especially if you have Black students, then that way they can engage in some networking and just some mentoring in those aspects. And then how we approach recruitment. So oftentimes people react and take offense to some of these topics or suggestions. And this diagram here at the bottom really points out intent versus how it's received. So we use this one for the recruitment when the man on the left is a member of the hiring committee, and he's asking this new potential hire, do you have a partner who will be coming on the visit and might want to learn more about job options? You know, maybe great intent, just like this is a friendly department where everyone helps one another out. But this individual might not know that because they've only been there for a day. And so they might be thinking, wow, they keep asking me about my partner. Maybe they cannot afford both of us. Will discussing my partner make me less desirable as a hire or affect my hire in any way? So they quickly answer, I don't have a two-body problem. Well, the communication here, there's an issue between what the intent was and how it's received, but still, we all need to be reflective of those conversations. And people are going to make mistakes in these conversations. That's part of it. And we have to acknowledge, just like we do in our science, that mistakes help us to grow. And that's the same thing here. So quickly being like, okay, so I have said that comment, and rather than like berating yourself about saying the comment, think about like, oh, I can see how, even though my intent was really good, how that could be interpreted. And this is just so that we can reflect on how do we portray our culture. So this next one, this is for another interactive aspect of the session, but maybe you can put this in the Q&A and I will stop talking for like a minute. What other examples have you experienced that have made you question whether you belong in physics or not? And you can share those, or maybe you just want to think about those. So going back to that imposter syndrome, what are some other examples that you have experienced that have made you question whether you belong in physics? Great, thank you so much for sharing. And again, don't feel like you have to here. And maybe you don't have to write this in the box because this might be someone else's truth, but maybe you've thought about like examples that others have brought to you, colleagues or students that have talked about feelings of imposter syndrome or experiences that they've had that could make them feel like they don't belong. So I'm gonna also put up another set of poll questions here, because this leads us, I don't want to leave you feeling like, well, what can I do? Because that's what we're getting to next. The first poll question I have is, how many of you have attended a mentoring training? Earlier, you said about 67% of our participants have mentored someone. So my next question is, how many of you have attended a mentoring training? Farah, do we have a response on this?
Yes, we have 64% of our audience says no, and 36% says yes.
Okay. Great. And then I have the next question, and I'll explain this because as I read it, I'm like, this is not as clear as I had intended. But the next question is, how many of you have read or listened to more work related to racism and sexism over the last 2 months? So I'm thinking of going back to when the Black Lives Matter protests started. It actually started with Black physicists who advocated for hashtag shutdown STEM Day. And as part of that, they asked people to, especially white people, to reflect on issues of racism in academia and specifically in physics. So that's what I'm asking in the poll question. How many of you have kind of looked more into and delved more into how racism and sexism affect physics in the last 2 months?
Okay, 95% of our audience says yes.
Oh my gosh, that really brings like joy to my heart. Excellent. That's really amazing. So that gets us to this sense of reflecting on the dominant culture in physics, which we already said is predominantly white and predominantly male, 80%. So this sense of reflecting on what we do not know and what we cannot experience and trying to understand it through other people's stories. I didn't say this at the beginning, but the other qualifier that I give physicists is that I am a qualitative researcher, not a quantitative researcher. So stories are really important to my work. But what I wanted to just kind of go through is talking about this sense of oftentimes when we're having encounters with people, for example, 75% of us have heard a racist or sexist joke in the last 2 years. And you probably thought, I don't like this, but I don't know how to handle this situation. And one of the things that we can do is this topic of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this comes from a international organization, the National Coalition Building Institute. These are their terms, but the reaction, what this is describing is the reaction to comments like that. So to change the culture of physics, which we established earlier, there's a toxic culture happening based on research that's out there and based on some of, for us, our own experiences within our departments or organizations. So to change the culture, we need to understand why and how it exists. So I've given you some examples, but I'm sure there's a lot more that you can delve into to understand this sense of how the history and the culture has been built for centuries. And then the other thing is to be a better mentor, recruiter, or ally. So even if you haven't mentored or you're not currently mentoring, you can be an ally. You can be a colleague that helps provide support. So we need to know how to have productive conversations. These in this box here, these are some of the things that you can say. And I would advocate you don't have to be, a warrior for this in all conversations. And if you feel that your blood pressure has risen because of a comment or statement, it might not be the best time to address those. But we can't begin to do this work until we practice it. So one of the other recommendations for this is to engage with a group. It could be just a group of colleagues, a lunch, or now the world that we're in, a Zoom session on maybe comments that you've heard, and you practice your response. Because it can't become second nature unless we practice it. So the idea here is to inquire, paraphrase, or reframe. So can you elaborate on what you mean by that, joke? Or it sounds like you have a really strong opinion about this. Maybe tell me why. So it sounds, or just reframing it. So it sounds like you think, and then you can kind of restate it. And that might not have been their intention. And it might not have been what they meant to say at all. So they have an opportunity to paraphrase. So what I have for the next two slides are some examples for us to participate in. And you can put your response in the questions box if you want. But for this first one, imagine you are at a conference with a colleague of yours who is Black. His name is Robert. You and Robert have been communicating via email and phone with another scientist, Simon, who is white. Simon has been very interested in your work. So while you and Robert are talking in front of your poster at the conference, Simon approaches, reads the poster, looks at the names, and then turns to Robert and says, "I had no idea you were Black. Wow, you were just so articulate. I would have never guessed that you were Black." You can tell that Robert is taken aback and slightly irritated. You say to Simon, A, "Simon, you are the most racist man I know." B, you don't say anything and walk away from both Robert and Simon. C, you say something to the effect of, "Simon, how would you feel if someone made that announcement to you? Can you see how your comments just made the focus about Robert's race and not his science? Can you see how your comments make it sound like you could be saying that Black people do not belong in physics based on your shock and sense that Robert is an outlier? How will comments like these help us maintain strong collaborations?" Clearly the answer is C, but these are a bunch of examples. Like you might not talk to Simon and ask all of those, but these are the examples of, so C is the good. The bad is ignoring it, just walking away, leaving poor Robert to represent his entire race to Simon, or engage in that emotional labor that falls upon people of color in many academic fields. And then the ugly is insulting people, which may be your first inclination. And that's why practice makes, I don't know if this is a thing, but practice makes perfect in these encounters. And so if you know that your initial, that we've got that like fight, flight, or freeze syndrome, if you know that you are one of those, the flight, you run away from it, the freeze, you just don't say anything, and the fight is you get angry and call someone a nasty name, then we have to work on that and how we can delve into that and reduce those initial reactions so that we can engage in this kind of work, particularly those of us who are members of the dominant group in physics. So here's another example just to think about. So here you are in the hallway as graduate students are coming out of a colloquium session and you're talking to them. all of a sudden you see John, a colleague of yours, he's a PI on a grant in your department, and he runs up to one of the 2 Black women graduate students in the department. There's only 2 in the department. He runs up to one of them, her name's Robin, and he begins yelling, he begins yelling, the data analysis for our most recent sample is all wrong. Why didn't you come to me for help? Robin looks confused and worried because she is not the Black graduate student on the grant with John. He has mistaken her for the only other Black woman graduate student in the department who actually does work on the grant and looks nothing like Robin. Robin quickly responds, Dr. So-and-so, you have me mistaken for your student Rashay. To which John says, oh, you all look alike. So now you say, and you've got your options here, A, John, you just confused the only 2 Black women in the department. What would you say if the dean constantly mixed you up with another colleague who looked nothing like you? Can you see how mistaking the only 2 Black women in the department could make them feel invisible and undervalued? Or B, you don't say anything and quickly walk away to your office to complain about John to another colleague. And C, John, how can you be so racist? You are the worst person in the department. So clearly here, again, A, you don't have to go through all of those questions. You could reframe, you could do any of the other things. These are more of the inquiry approach. You can tell what my approach is. And the others, so you've got the bad, you don't say anything and walk away. So commiserating with colleagues about how awful John is doesn't help Robin or Rashay in this experience. And it doesn't demonstrate to Robin or Rashay that you are a department that cares about their experience. They see people running off and not helping them or not saying something different from what John is. So they might interpret that the entire department feels the same way as John. And then calling John a racist or the worst person in the department, it may or may not be accurate, but it doesn't help to engage in changing the culture. So part of this is also demonstrating that the sexist jokes, you don't tolerate them. And you don't have to be a buzzkill for that. There's no need for the sexist jokes in the department. And the more people who start standing up for those standing up against those sexist and racist jokes and actually articulating that, then people see that the majority of the department actually do not stand for that kind of behavior. So the last slide I have here is this sense of, I don't want you to leave thinking, well, I mean, now I have to engage in uncomfortable conversations. That might not be where you are right now. But what you can do is mentor. And mentoring is so incredibly important. And what's the struggle for many of us is that the structure of physics is that there's this apprenticeship model where you have a mentor, your major professor who kind of helps you along your way, postdoc maybe, or career, etc. But we can all be a mentor in a different way. And there can be that mentor, but what if that's the gatekeeper to your career, and that mentor is sexually harassing the student or engaging in discrimination against the student, whether it's just microaggressions every day. So we all can serve as mentors for students, for early career scientists in our department. And if you're like, but I only know how to mentor based on how my major professor mentored me, there are actually trainings for mentors. APS has trainings that they do especially for mentoring students of color. But I have up here iGen, the Inclusive Graduate Education Network, which is based out of the biomedical scientists, but is working with APS to develop trainings for not just physics and biomedical, but chemistry and engineering. And they have resources online, all virtual now as well. So looking into what that looks like. What does mentoring look like? Because some of us have only had training from one person. So what are ways that we can be authentic and mentor people? So learn how to be an even better mentor through those. Learn how to interrupt microaggressions. That's the good, the bad, the ugly. Hopefully we're all moving more towards the good. And I will say that I try to engage in interrupting microaggressions, and sometimes it's bad and sometimes it's ugly. So, but I can't learn from those mistakes unless I make them. And then the beginning of this presentation was reflecting on your own role. What role are you playing in maybe interrupting microaggressions, or maybe upholding a culture of white supremacy in the department, or a culture of physics is a culture with no culture? How are you upholding that? And finally, broadening your network. So two colleagues of mine have, Dr. A and Dr. Tay, as they call themselves, have been doing this regular session on Zoom, Stemming While Black. And they had part 2 on July 18th. Please look for, you can Google this in Twitter or in on Facebook, but this is about an hour-and-a-half session that's been occurring monthly, and it's a group of Black scientists, engineers, technology experts, mathematicians, and they answer Q&A questions and talk about their work and talk about their experiences. That's just one way to broaden your network. LinkedIn is another way that we recruit folks through LinkedIn. And broadening your network in LinkedIn, looking at that, that's a real, like, you see the data right there in LinkedIn. What does your network look like? Are there any people of color in your network, and how can you broaden that? So those are just some easy steps that you can do right now after this session. This is my reference slide. So again, you can, you're gonna get a copy of this presentation so you can look at these and investigate further, as I know physicists like to do. And that leads us to about 8 minutes for Q&A. So I'll let Farah clue me into any questions that I could answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Roxanne. That was wonderful. Due to the sensitive nature of this webinar, we will stop recording the webinar right now and then continue on to the question and answer session.